Hi, my name is Isha, and welcome to my first YouTube video ever. So I really like law and makeup, so I decided to smoosh them together, and I'm going to talk about some of the more interesting or fun cases that I learned about in law school while I do my makeup. I was inspired to do this by Bailey Sarian and Robert Welsh. They do these Get Ready With Me's while talking about... Bailey talks about murder mysteries, Robert does ghost stories, and I find them really fun and entertaining to watch. So I decided to give it a whirl in the legal world, see if that's something that people enjoy. Two disclaimers before we get started. One, I am not a makeup artist. I am in no way, shape, or form an expert or an artiste, if you will. So please do not expect like Bailey or Robert level makeup. Like whatever like baseline makeup is, that's what I got. So that's what's going to be happening on my face. Maybe worse than that, but at least it'll be entertaining to watch me fail at doing eyeshadow. Second disclaimer, this is not legal advice. I cannot give you legal advice. This is purely for informational and fun purposes. If you do need legal advice about a particular matter, please consult your own attorney and obtain advice from them. Not from me. Okay, I think we're ready to get started.
Oh, my hair. So hot up.
So, the case that I want to talk about today is called Leonard v. Pepsico, and I think it's a very fun case. So, essentially, in the 90s, 1995, I believe, Pepsi ran this campaign for like Pepsi points and Pepsi stuff. So, it was called Drink Pepsi, Get Stuff, and basically customers... Oh, by the way, I'll link everything that I'm using on my face in the description box below. Pepsi ran this campaign called Drink Pepsi, Get Stuff. So you essentially buy Pepsi products and you accumulate Pepsi points. You buy Pepsi products, you accumulate Pepsi points, and then you can exchange them for Pepsi stuff. There's like this catalog of Pepsi stuff, and you like fill out an order form and you send them your Pepsi points and you can get stuff. So in order to advertise this Pepsi stuff campaign, they ran an ad on TV where it's basically this kid is getting ready to go to school, and as he's getting ready he puts on his Pepsi stuff and they advertise what kind of stuff you can get with it. So he's getting ready for school, he throws on his Pepsi t-shirt, and at the bottom of the screen it says 75 Pepsi points. And he throws on his Pepsi stuffed leather jacket, and at the bottom of the screen it says 1,450 Pepsi points. And he's got like glasses and stuff. And you can go watch this ad. Honestly, me describing it does not do it justice. It's so 90s and so wonderful to watch. Just go watch the ad. Pause me on YouTube, search Pepsi Harrier Jet ad, and it'll come up. And the reason the Harrier Jet is so important is because this kid is getting ready for school, and he shows up to school in what's called a Harrier Jet, which is a military grade fighter jet. And once he lands at school, the cockpit like opens up and he goes, "Sure beats taking the bus." Very tongue-in-cheek Pepsi ad. And when they were making this ad, Pepsi was like, we wanted to throw in a bit of zany Pepsi humor because that's who we are. We're Pepsi. By the way, this is a Coca-Cola household. We don't drink Pepsi here. We only drink Coke Zero because that's just who I am. But Pepsi's also great. I'm not picky, except when I have a choice, then I will pick Coke. Okay, so Pepsi's ran this ad with the Harrier Jet. The kid gets out of the jet. At the bottom of the screen, it says 7 million Pepsi points. So according to the ad, you can get this Harrier Jet for 7 million Pepsi points, which when Pepsi was making the ad, they thought 7 million Pepsi points is a lot of points. Like nobody's gonna get 7 million Pepsi points. Except there was one guy named John Leonard, and he saw this ad and he was like, I want the jet. Which naturally, that's what, for 7 million Pepsi points you can get this jet. Yeah, I want the jet. That's pretty cool. Give me the jet. So he starts buying up Pepsi products because he's like, I want this jet. He pretty soon realizes that it would take a lot. He'd have to buy, like, he couldn't consume Pepsi quick enough, and he'd have to buy like so many Pepsi products in order to get to 7 million Pepsi points. He was like, this is ridiculous. But then he read the fine print on one of these Pepsi products, and he realized you can buy Pepsi points with cash. Each point is worth 10 cents. So he could buy 7 million Pepsi points with $700,000. So that's what he does. Now, John Leonard is a very very smart guy. He's a business student. He's a 21-year-old business student. That's all I know about him. That's all the Google would tell me. I couldn't really find out anything about him after the case. So this is all information from the judicial opinion itself and like a few news stories from the 90s about this guy. So John Leonard is a 21-year-old business student who gets together a whole bunch of business investors and decides that he is going to raise $700,000, send it to Pepsi, along with 15 Pepsi points. In the fine print, you can buy things with the 10 cents per point, but you also have to accompany it with at least 15 Pepsi points themselves. So he sends Pepsi 15 Pepsi points and $700,000 that he has raised. Let's back up here a little bit. Why does John Leonard, the business student, want this jet? Do you guys ever have like one good eye, one like garbage eye when you're doing your makeup? It's always one eye that doesn't cooperate. Anyway, John Leonard wants this jet because Harrier jet's retail price, it's a military jet, you can't buy it off a showroom floor, but a Harrier jet costs like $30 million. Pepsi said for 7 million Pepsi points or $700,000 cash, you can get a Harrier jet. That's amazing. That's quite a deal. That's a steal. You telling me I can get a $30 million jet for $700,000? Yeah, I'm gonna try and get the jet. Can't resist a good sale. This eyeball is, look at that shape versus that shape. Whatever. Told you guys you weren't getting artistry. Just gonna get whatever ends up happening on my face. Back to the story. That's why John Leonard wants this jet. So he sues Pepsi in true American fashion for breach of contract. Now, the main issue in this case that has to be decided is that Pepsi is arguing the Harrier jet was a joke. And besides, an ad doesn't constitute an offer for contract. So the court has to assess whether or not the Harrier jet was a joke. One might be thinking, why is John Leonard suing, right? Why didn't he sent the money to Pepsi. Pepsi said, no, we're not gonna give you this jet. Why is he suing? Why, who is this guy? Well, according to the judicial opinion, Leonard is, and I quote, he describes himself as typical of the Pepsi generation. He is young, has an adventurous spirit, and the notion of obtaining a Harrier jet appealed to him enormously. Now, it should also be noted that the Harrier jet was not in the Pepsi stuff catalog that you're supposed to order the Pepsi stuff from, but that didn't stop him. So this man's is gonna go all in. Pepsi and the ad agency that they contracted with, who's also sued in this case, both contend that the Harrier jet part of the ad was a joke. It's part of Pepsi's zany humor. They were like, we were taking what we're doing with this Pepsi points, kind of extrapolated it, made it like kind of this big ridiculous thing, like slapped on a crazy high number to it. We didn't think anybody would be able to get to 7 million Pepsi points. It was all a joke. And Leonard is arguing that you can't say whether this was a joke because you cannot know whether or not people of my generation, the Pepsi generation, or people that were watching the ad took it as a joke. I mean, I took it seriously, so you can't know that, is basically what Leonard's saying. I won't keep you guys waiting in suspense. The court rules for Pepsi and says that the ad is clearly a joke. First of all, ads are not offers of contract. They can't be construed as such. And two, including the Harrier jet in the ad was a joke. No reasonable person would have thought that it was a serious offer. It wasn't in the Pepsi stuff catalog. There's no way that this Harrier jet is part of the Pepsi stuff campaign. But the way they got to that conclusion is the fun part. I don't know what I've done on my eyeballs. I tried to make it Pepsi, but oh well. It is what it is. So even the court that's hearing this case kind of realizes the ridiculousness of the situation. They're like, you're really telling us to tell you why the Harrier jet is a joke? Okay. And then the judge says this, and I quote, explaining why a joke is funny is a daunting task. As the essayist E.B. White has remarked, humor can be dissected, as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process. And then the opinion launches into an entire analysis of why the inclusion of the Harrier jet is clearly a joke. First, the court notes that the commercial does what most commercials do, and it shows that using their products will transform what is like your ordinary, basic life. If you buy their stuff, you will suddenly become very attractive and popular and, you know, all that good stuff that you long for in life. So you use the Pepsi points, you get the Pepsi stuff, and you'll be transformed into this cool adolescent teenager person. Second, the court says that the adolescent youth in the ad is a highly improbable pilot. There's no way that this child essentially is flying a Harrier jet. So that's part of the joke too. Third, the court notes that getting to school in a Harrier jet is purely adolescent fantasy. I mean, you know, what kid doesn't want to show up to school in a fly-aft ride? And Harrier jet, pretty fly, literally flies you to school. Of course, the ad itself is a joke because the ad ignores all of the physics of getting a jet from your house to your school. It shows, because of the jet, like people's clothes are flying off, which, you know, also isn't really what happens near a jet. So because it ignores the laws of physics, it's also a joke. Fourth, the court notes that the point of a Harrier jet is to target and destroy surface and air targets. Now, Leonard contends that that's not really that big of a deal because you can still get a Harrier jet that doesn't have those capabilities. So it'll be fine. But the court says that because that's the actual point of the Harrier jet for intelligence, reconnaissance, military defense type stuff, you know, the use in the ad was clearly facetious. There was no reason for Pepsi to put the Harrier jet in the ad other than as a joke, because no one in their right mind would be like, oh yeah, I want this jet that can destroy things for like everyday life. T-shirt, leather jacket, yes. Harrier jet, no. And fifth, the court notes that the amount of points needed to acquire the Harrier jet, 7 million, is like astronomically large. You know, the t-shirt is 75 points, the leather jacket is 1,450 points. These are all attainable goals, but 7 million Pepsi points is way too much. Even Leonard tried to acquire 7 million Pepsi points by buying and consuming Pepsi products, and he couldn't. He had to resort to buying them with cash. So the court was like, clearly Pepsi never intended for the Harrier jet to be up for grabs, and a reasonable person wouldn't think that the Harrier jet was up for grabs. So as I mentioned before, Leonard's attorneys are arguing that a reasonable person, you can't say whether or not a reasonable person would have taken this in jest. They might not have known it was a joke. And Leonard's attorneys also argue that an objective, reasonable person would say that the Harrier jet in the Pepsi commercial is an offer. Like, why would you put that in the ad if that's not what you were offering? That's like false advertising otherwise. The court rejects this argument. The court also says, remember how it only cost Leonard $700,000 to get the 7 million Pepsi points, but a Harrier jet cost like $30 million? Well, the court also says that a reasonable person would also think of this offer as too good to be true, and therefore know that that part of the ad was in jest. With all that in mind, Leonard loses, and he doesn't get his jet, which I personally think is really sad. I think he should have gotten the jet, or like something, because yes, in contract law, in the restatement of contracts, an ad doesn't constitute an offer, a joke doesn't constitute an offer, etc. There's like another one that calls it like mere puffery. But here's the thing, the general public doesn't know the ins and outs of contract law. Contract law is really complicated. I still don't fully understand it. I'm studying for the bar and I'm like still only a little bit getting it. So, you know, you can't really say that an objective, reasonable person in this instance wouldn't have considered the jet as part of the Pepsi stuff catalog. Anyway, as this was going on, Pepsi changed its commercial, so underneath the Harrier jet, instead of saying 7 million Pepsi points, it said 700 million Pepsi points, which, like, why did they do that from the beginning? But, you know, humans don't really understand large numbers. Our brains can't fathom it, so it makes sense that in the beginning Pepsi didn't go with that big of a number in the first place. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think that Leonard should have gotten the jet, or do you think that the court made the right call following contract law? Because the ad was clearly a joke. So I was also curious to figure out what if Leonard had won? Like, what if he did win the jet? Would he actually get a jet? The answer is probably no. In contract law, specific performance, where you get like the specific thing that you wanted, is disfavored and money damages are favored. So Leonard was likely going for the $30 million value of the Harrier jet, which still would have been insane. I don't think he necessarily should have gotten $30 million, but he put in some work. I mean, I think some value of whatever Harrier jet was featured in the Pepsi commercial would have been sufficient, in my opinion. Although, how cool would it have been if he actually got the jet? I know the Pentagon and like the Department of the Defense would never allow that, but still a cool thing to think about. Take my hair down. My graduation hat. And that, my friends, is Leonard v. Pepsico. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so very much for watching me and watching my first video. I don't know how this will go. I'm gonna try to maybe upload once a week if this is interesting to people. Thanks again for watching. This was surprisingly very fun. I was extremely nervous to film this, but ended up being not so bad. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!